Hello guys and welcome back. So for those of you that live in Australia and perhaps some of my international friends, you could not possibly have missed this recent headline if you are into true crime. It was Australia's most notorious female serial killer is released from prison after serving 20 years. Over doubts of her guilt. It is a huge and complex story that I am going to attempt to break down over the next 30 minutes, so wish me luck. And by the way, I have been sick, so I am a little bit nasally, a little bit stuffy, so let's just ignore that. And having said all of that, let's get into today's video. So Kathleen Megan Folbigg was born on June 14, 1967 in Sydney's inner west to parents Thomas John Britton and Kathleen May Donovan. Sadly, her life did get off to an incredibly difficult start. Her mother walked out on her at a very young age, leaving her father to raise her on his own. And unfortunately, her father was not exactly a very good man. He had a criminal history, and it was one of extreme violence. In fact, he had actually slashed the throat of his former partner. She did survive, but he did claim to have killed others. It is unknown if Kathleen ever suffered any abuse at the hands of her father, but one thing is for certain, and that is that her father could not handle looking after her on his own. And one day, in a fit of rage and likely seeking revenge, he hunted down Kathleen's mother, Kathleen, and stabbed her 24 times in the street. Sadly, she did not survive. Thomas Britton was arrested following this murder and he was eventually sentenced to 15 years in jail, leaving young Kathleen, who was now just 18 months old, without a mother or a father. As a result, Kathleen Folbigg, who was back then Kathleen Donovan, became a ward of the state, meaning that she was now under the care of the government. She would spend the next year or so being shuffled from foster home to foster home and to a few relatives' homes as well, before finally being fostered out to a couple from Newcastle, or Newey, Neville and Deirdre Marlborough. She also gained an older sister named Leah Bone. Growing up, Kathleen was aware that Neville and Deirdre were not her biological parents, but she was under the impression that they did adopt her, as opposed to fostering her, but I'll get back to that point in just 1 minute. In high school, Katara High, Kathleen had a very loyal and a solid group of girlfriends, and in fact, she actually remains friends with some of these girls to this day, just to really reiterate how incredible her, support base has been over the years. And it was some of these same girls that stood by Kathleen's side during the hard times that lay ahead of her. Unfortunately, during high school, things were quite tough at home for Kathleen. Neville and Deirdre were quite strict and overbearing parents and were rather controlling over Kathleen's life. And things really came to a head when Kathleen was about 16 and a caseworker told her some news that she was not expecting to hear. The caseworker told her that Neville and Deirdre had actually not adopted her, but in fact she was only fostered by them, meaning that Kathleen was still a ward of the state. And at first maybe this might not sound like a big deal. Adopted, fostered, what's the difference? But to go through, and I haven't been through it myself, of course, so my information or my knowledge is quite limited, but to go through the adoption process is quite arduous and it's a long and complicated process, but to do it, to adopt somebody really shows, I think, a level of commitment to that person that you're adopting, to the child that you're adopting, and for them to never have done that. And for Kathleen to, I guess she would have felt like she didn't belong anywhere because technically she didn't belong anywhere. She'd never been adopted. She was technically by law still owned by the government, basically, still under their care. I think that would have been a crisis of self, like a crisis of identity. And at 16, I feel very sorry for Kathleen and what she was going through. I'm glad she had some incredible friends that, as I said, have stuck by her side through thick and thin. But just what a sad thing to find out. But this was actually not the only devastating piece of news that Kathleen would find out from this caseworker. She also found out that her own biological father had murdered her mother. So as you can imagine, at this time, at 16 years old, when things are already so difficult and such a struggle. I think at 16 we're all grappling with our own identity and who we are and trying to figure out our life. To add this into the mix, I can't imagine, and I couldn't find too much information as to how Kathleen handled this news. It actually sounded like she handled it well, like she was a pretty tough cookie. But anyway, I just wanted to give you an idea of what this woman has been through in her life. And this is only at age 16. So let's continue. Oh, and by the way, add to this the fact this was like the mid-1980s, and she didn't receive any help from like therapy or psychologists, psychiatrists. It just wasn't a common thing to do back then. So she's really gone through this probably just speaking to friends about it. And even her friends said she didn't speak much about it. So it's likely something that Kathleen ended up bottling up because she wasn't super close to her parents at the time. She didn't speak to her friends much about it. So goodness knows how she really absorbed this information. Anyway, shortly after Kathleen found out all of this shocking information, she actually dropped out of high school, out of Katara High. It was in her last year of high school, and it was just too much. Things were too much at home. I'm guessing she was pretty over school at this point, and she actually moved in with a friend, Billy Joe, and her mother, and she got her job as well. So let's skip ahead to one night in 1985 when Kathleen was 18 years old and she was out with Billy Joe at a disco, because I'm guessing that's what teenagers did in the 80s. They went to discos. I don't know. Sounds kind of cool. Anyway, she was out at this disco when she met a man named Craig Folbigg. He was 24 years old and a mining company employee, and as you may have guessed from his last name, he turned out to be her future husband. And basically from the beginning, Kathleen was smitten with Craig. She just loved that he was caring and protective, and he came from a big family and she loved that, and he was a great dancer, and they moved pretty quickly in their relationship. They soon had moved in together, and within 2 years, when Kathleen was just 20 years old, the couple were married. And 1 year later, the couple were pregnant with their first child. On February 1, 1989, Craig and Kathleen welcomed their son, Caleb Gibson Folbigg, into the world, and he was a healthy and happy baby boy, although he did have a mild birth defect called laryngomalacia. I hope I've pronounced that correct, but as we all know, I am shocking at pronouncing basically anything. But basically, it's also known as floppy larynx, meaning that when Caleb would breathe in, part of the tissue above his vocal cords would fall in and actually block or partially block his airways, making it difficult to breathe and also causing him to have quite loud and heavy breathing, which was the main symptom that Kathleen and Craig noticed in their son. But doctors basically told them not to worry, that the condition would clear up on its own, as it often did with infants born with a floppy larynx. Sadly, Caleb did not grow out of this, and on February 20, at just 19 days old, Kathleen found Caleb passed away in his crib. His sudden and tragic passing was attributed to SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. And for those of you that do not know what SIDS is or have not heard of it, I am going to read the definition straight off the Red Nose Australia website so I don't get it incorrect. It states, the sudden and unexpected death of an infant under 1 year of age with an onset of a fatal episode occurring during sleep that remains unexplained through investigation, including performance of an autopsy and review of the circumstances of death and the clinical history, end quote. Despite their pain and their grief, Craig and Kathleen decided to try for another child, and they were actually able to fall pregnant again rather quickly. The following year, on June 3rd, 1990, their second son, Patrick Allen Folbigg, was born. Everything was going well for the first few months until October 18, when Craig was awakened one night by the sound of his wife screaming. And this screaming was coming from Patrick's room. Of course, Craig ran to his son's bedroom to see what was going on, and he saw that Patrick had turned blue, so he began performing CPR as they waited for an ambulance to arrive. The ambulance did soon arrive, and they took young Patrick to the hospital, and he actually did go on to survive this terrifying ordeal. But he was diagnosed with epilepsy and cortical blindness. And this episode was later thought to have been his first seizure. 4 months later, in February of 1991, Kathleen called Craig at work and told him it's happened again. She had found her son, Patrick, passed away at just 8 months old, and it's believed that he did die from a seizure. After this second tragic loss, Craig and Kathleen decided it was time to leave Newcastle and head somewhere different for a fresh start, and they headed to a place called Maitland, which was about a 40-minute drive from Newcastle. And they did cautiously make the decision to try for another child, although I can't begin to imagine how scary and terrifying it would be to be putting all your faith into trying again without truly knowing what had caused the first 2 deaths of your children. Like, that's incomprehensible. It really is. Like the previous times, they fell pregnant fast, and on October 14, 1992, the couple gave birth to their first daughter, Sarah Kathleen Folbigg. Unfortunately, she would meet the same fate as her siblings and suffered with breathing issues, and it was Kathleen that once again found Sarah passed away in her cot on August 29. She had lived the longest out of all of her siblings, making it to 10 months, and it again had been Kathleen that found her daughter not breathing in her crib. So it seemed like with each child, they were living longer and longer, but nothing was truly being explained with each passing of each child. Of course, we had Patrick and he had his seizures, but even at the time, they didn't completely understand what the underlying catalyst was for his passing. That was sort of just the presumed reason for why he passed away. Unsurprisingly, Craig and Kathleen did separate after losing their third child. I'm sure they were under so much stress and just the depression and everything would have, we most of us can't begin to imagine what losing 3 children would do to a marriage, but they did separate for a time, but they did actually make their way back together, and they ended up moving once again from Maitland to a place called Singleton, which was again about a 40-minute drive from their last location. And in late 1996, they found out they were pregnant once again with their 4th child, and at this point it had been 3 years since they had lost Sarah, which was the biggest gap that they had gone not having a child or being pregnant. Their fourth daughter, Laura Elizabeth Folbigg, was born on August 7, 1997, and 1 year later the entire family rejoiced as they celebrated Laura's first birthday party. As Laura was the first Folbigg child to reach this milestone, you can imagine just how special and how big this celebration was for not only the Folbigg family, but friends and everybody that knew this couple. It not only was it a massive celebration because Laura had made it to 1 year old, but 1 year is generally the cutoff for having a SIDS baby. It's like they had finally reached that point where they could consider their child safe. So they probably did get to the point where they thought they could breathe this sigh of relief. Laura was going to be fine. They didn't have to worry. Their life was finally coming together. Their marriage was finally rebuilding itself. And Kathleen truly felt like she had finally broken the curse with her fourth child, with her second daughter. At this point, Kathleen had actually begun to believe it was her own genetics that had been killing her children. At first, she thought that perhaps that her genetics were killing just boys, but when she lost Sarah, she was at a loss. And funnily enough, we'll go back to this later in the video, but Kathleen was right. Her genetics did play a part in it, but again, we'll discuss that towards the end of the video. Anyway, at this point, it really just felt like things had finally fallen into place for this couple that had been together 10 years and had literally been to hell and back. Laura truly was their light at the end of the tunnel. However, just 6 months later, Kathleen would find Laura in an unresponsive state. She phoned an ambulance telling them, "My baby's not breathing. I've had 3 SIDS deaths already." Laura unfortunately did not make it, passing away due to cardiac issues. During her autopsy, although these cardiac issues were evident, when the pathologist discovered that all 3 of Laura's siblings had also died at a very young age, he actually marked her death as unknown and reported it to the police. That same year, which was 1999, Craig also began to become suspicious of his wife and handed over Kathleen's personal diaries to the police and actually assisted them in building up a case against her. And until now, nobody had been suspicious of Kathleen harming her own children. And of course, unsurprisingly, the following year, Craig and Kathleen split up for good. In their 10 years, as I said, they had been to hell and back, losing 4 children aged between 19 days and 18 months. And this marriage that was just littered with tragedy had ended in the husband suspecting the wife of murdering 4 of their children. What an insane and incomprehensible situation that, as I said, I don't think many of us, I hope most of us, cannot even begin to understand. I'm glad I can't understand it. I never want to be I'm speechless because, we're not even at the end of this video, and what this woman has gone through blows my mind. The fact that she is still alive today, is still standing, still fighting, continued to fight. Anyway, let's continue with this story. The year following Craig and Kathleen's separation, Kathleen was arrested on suspicion of murdering all 4 of her children. And she was, as you can imagine, shocked and distraught. She protested her innocence, telling the police that all 4 of her kids had died of natural causes. The police didn't buy it, however. 4 baby deaths in one family? What were the chances? And her diary entries, well, they spoke volumes, according to the police, but we'll get into them in just 1 second.
January 1997. Can you start from the start of that entry?
Another year gone and what a year to come. I have a baby on the way, which means major personal sacrifice for both of us, but I feel confident about it all going well. This time I am going to call for help this time and not attempt to do everything myself anymore. I know that was the main reason for my stress before, and stress made me do terrible things.
What terrible things?
Again, talking about just stress and frustrations and the odd growling and anything of that sort of nature.
So the stress made you do terrible things?
Yeah, as in have an angry thought here or there. Don't think I've met a parent that doesn't have an angry thought every now and then if their child's arguing with them or something's not going quite right or it's just not happening. As in, take Sarah, for example, when she wouldn't go to sleep, then sure, the battle of wills would kick in, the frustration would kick in, and yes, I would have an angry thought, but it was never to harm her. But it was always, why wasn't Craig here to help me? Or, or something along those lines.
The things that you're saying that you viewed as terrible things, the frustrations and the stresses that go on with being a parent of a young child particularly, you've said, every parent feels that at some time, to some degree, and yet children don't die of it.
Yes, I know that. But after 4, what are you supposed to think? You start thinking, is it possible?
Kathleen was eventually charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 of manslaughter. The trial, which was a trial by jury, began in 2003, with the prosecution arguing that Kathleen had smothered all 4 of her children in moments of anger or frustration, despite the fact there was no physical evidence of homicide. In fact, there wasn't any evidence of any form of abuse. No markings, no broken bones, no signs of a struggle, and by all accounts, these children were well dressed, well fed, and very much loved. The prosecution tried their best to make Kathleen out to look like a terrible mother, pointing out that she would often complain that she couldn't get to the gym, that she had gained weight, that she was tired, that she just wanted time to herself. So basically, like every single new mother, they also made a point to remind the jury that Kathleen had been the one to find her children every single time, except for the fact that Kathleen was literally a stay-at-home mum. So who else was meant to find them? Craig went to work full-time, so it was basically always Kathleen that was attending to the children. It's like she couldn't avoid being the one to find them. So it was a bit of a moot point, really. Like, it doesn't make sense. Kathleen remained firm in her claims that all 4 children had died of natural causes, although she never took the stand at any time during the trial. She did remain quite stoic and quite emotionless, actually, which unsurprisingly worked against her in the media. I mean, we only have to look at past cases to not be surprised by this, really. We've got Azaria Chamberlain and Lindy, her mother, Lindy Chamberlain, I hate to use the phrase, the dingo ate my baby case, where Lindy was really crucified in the media for showing very little emotion, and she did end up being found guilty and sentenced to 3 years, even though it would turn out she was innocent. We also have the Joanne Lees and Peter Falconio case, where Joanne Lees's boyfriend, I'm going off the top of my head with this one, went missing in the outback. Really interesting case. But anyway, she survived. He went missing, never to be found again. She was never found guilty, but she also showed very little emotion in the media, and until to this very day, people think that Joanne Lees killed her boyfriend, Peter. So all this to say basically that when women that are on trial or could potentially be on trial do not show emotion, the media and the public begin to form this opinion that we are guilty because we are emotional creatures. So if we are not showing emotion, we must be guilty, right? Anyway, I'm obviously joking, but that's basically what happened in this case. People had crucified, or people began to crucify Kathleen before a verdict was even read. Anyway, the case against Kathleen was almost entirely circumstantial, with the star of the trial basically being her diary entries. And these diary entries were really just a day-to-day account of her life as a mother, losing her children, her struggles, her thoughts, just things that anyone would write in their diary, except for the fact that, of course, Kathleen had been through so much. So she really detailed her thoughts during this time in her life. And of course, as you can imagine, losing all of her children, losing 4 children, she very much blamed herself. Of course, by doing so, by blaming herself, they almost read as admissions of guilt. So when the prosecution picked out certain passages out of context and read them out loud to the court, to the jury, it didn't sound good. I will read you some of these passages now so you can get an idea of what was written. And by the way, at the time, these diary entries were not analysed by any sort of professional, psychologist, psychiatrist, nobody. They weren't really being looked at through the eyes of a grieving mother. They were looked at in a very black and white fashion almost. But anyway, in 1997, Kathleen wrote, "Laura's a fairly good-natured baby, thank goodness. It saved her from the fate of her siblings. I think she was warned," end quote. And that same year, in a separate entry, she wrote, "One day she will leave. The others did, but this one's not going in the same fashion. This time I'm prepared and I know what signals to watch out for in myself," end quote. Another short excerpt read out in court stated, "All I wanted was to shut her up, and one day she did." I'll read you this last one, another quick one. "I knew I was short-tempered and cruel sometimes to her, and she left with a bit of help," end quote. I think you guys get the point when I say that although none of these entries were direct admissions of guilt, they didn't exactly paint Kathleen in the best light when read out in these short excerpts and not analysing them from the point of view of a grieving mother blaming herself. But anyway, we will get back to these diary entries a little later in the video. So the prosecution also heavily leaned into a concept called Meadows' Law, which has now been proven to be completely false and inaccurate. Meadows' Law was conceptualised by a British paediatrician, and he stated that 1, a sudden infant death is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 is murder until proven otherwise. The suggestion being, of course, that the probability of all 4 of Kathleen's children dying of natural causes was incredibly low, if not impossible. And the prosecution even brought on several medical experts to ask them if they had ever seen anything like this, a case like this, where 4 children had died of SIDS from one family, and they all said no. We have since learnt, however, that your chances of having another SIDS child after losing one does not diminish with each child. In fact, we now know that your chances of having another SIDS child after having one slightly increases, although it's still not completely understood why. In fact, we don't, in general, completely understand SIDS as a whole. There's still research to be done, but it's nonsensical to say that it's impossible to have 4 SIDS babies in one family. In fact, it's completely possible. It's rare, like it doesn't happen often, but it can certainly happen. And unfortunately, this Meadows' Law would actually be the catalyst of several women that had lost babies due to SIDS ending up in prison. The amount of damage this ridiculous concept did is unbelievable, honestly. And one of the saddest cases that I stumbled upon while doing my research for this video was about a woman named Sally Clark. So in 1999, Sally Clark was a former solicitor, and she was found guilty of murdering her 2 infant sons, convicted in part because of misleading evidence provided by Roy Meadow at the trial. Sally ended up having an incredibly tough time in prison, not only because she had been a solicitor, but because child killers don't exactly fare well behind bars. Her conviction was eventually quashed in 2003 when it was proven that both her sons passed away due to SIDS. However, Sally never fully recovered from the trauma of the ordeal that she was put through, and she died of alcohol poisoning in 2007. An incredibly sad story, one I tell you because I want to emphasize just how dangerous this Meadows law was. And although it wasn't actually directly used in Kathleen's trial, the implication was there, which is dangerous enough. The prosecution even used Kathleen's own past against her, claiming that she was predisposed to violence due to her father killing her mother when she was 18 months old, as if Kathleen has any control over that whatsoever. And the final blow to Kathleen was her ex-husband, Craig, testifying against her at the trial, which when the husband or ex-husband testifies against the wife in a trial like this, it's just not a good look. You want to see spousal support. Well, the jury would want to see spousal support, and of course they did not see that. And I don't want to even bring up Craig's name past this point in the video because he's done literally nothing to ever support his wife. He's done nothing since to help her out, support her, do anything that would have any benefit to her life, and that's all I'm really going to say on the matter because he's not even worth bringing up again. In May of 2003, after a 7-week trial, Kathleen Folbigg was found guilty on 3 counts of murder and 1 of maliciously inflicting grievous bodily harm on Caleb. For the first time in the trial, Kathleen let her emotions flow, letting out a loud, painful wailing sound as the verdict was read. And the media headlines that followed this trial were just horrendous. We had Australia's worst female serial killer, baby killer, Australia's worst mother. Headlines that I can't even imagine what they would have done to her morale. Kathleen was eventually sentenced to 40 years with a non-parole period of 30. And in 2005, on appeal, that was reduced to 30 years with a non-parole period of 25. And to say Kathleen's time in jail over the years was difficult is an understatement. She did have friends visiting her very regularly, which I'm sure did help, but because she was a massive target in jail, I'm sure due to not only her notoriety, but of course, as I said before, child killers just don't do well in prison. She was targeted, and it meant she spent most of her time in isolation, which cannot be good for anybody in jail, let alone someone that's been through what she has. So let's jump ahead to 2015. Kathleen has been in jail for 12 years, and people outside of her supporters, her friends and family, are beginning to believe that there's a possibility that she is innocent. And more importantly, pathologists are coming forward and saying that they believe there is a possibility that Kathleen did not kill all 4 of her children, and that it's very possible that they all died of natural causes. And by the way, at this point, Meadows' law has been proven to be complete and utter bullshit. So that whole theory of, 1 death is sad, 2 is suspicious, 3 is homicide, that's been completely chucked out. Nobody believes that by this point. And that same year, a post-conviction review process is requested due to new forensic pathology findings. In 2018, a new inquiry is finally announced, and Kathleen herself actually spoke at this inquiry, defending her long-considered controversial diary entries, and she explained in her own words what she intended or what she meant when she wrote these entries. She said, quote, "I didn't kill my children, and these diary entries are a record of just how depressed I was and what a struggle I was having," end quote. New medical evidence was also put forward at this inquiry, which revolved around genetic mutations found in both Sarah and Laura. However, there just wasn't quite enough proof or evidence at the time to prove that these mutations had been the cause of the girls' deaths. And in the end, the inquiry concluded that the new evidence neither proved nor disproved that any of the children were smothered. And it wrapped up, quote, "The only consideration reasonably open is that somebody intentionally caused harm to the children and smothering was the obvious method. The evidence pointed to no person other than Miss Folbigg," end quote. And this inquiry, that they were really getting so close to being able to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the 4 children had died of natural causes, but they just weren't quite there. They were so close. Like, science was catching up slowly but surely, but it had just a touch more to go, but we're getting there. By the way, it's worth mentioning that my understanding of science is pretty rubbish. So I've simplified these scientific findings down to an easy to understand sort of explanation, because I want it to be easy for anyone watching this to understand. I wanted it to be easy for myself to understand. And there is definitely resources out there. And I'm going to recommend the Mother's Guilt podcast is what I listen to, that goes into a very detailed explanation as to all the science behind that. If you really want to get into the grit of this case and all the fine details, and that podcast does a really great job understanding it. I'm explaining it at a very base level, a very simplified level of what happened. But anyway, let's continue. I just wanted to clarify that in case anybody's like, you missed this, and this. I missed all of the finer details of the scientific proof, scientific research, but I have put it into the simplest terms for everybody to understand. Anyway, the following year in 2020, some significant progress finally started happening. A professor from the immunology and genomic medicine department at Australian National University began looking at Kathleen's case and the genetic mutations that had been found in both Sarah and Laura that I mentioned before, and the possibility that these genetic mutations had been what had caused both their deaths. And as I mentioned earlier, it was Kathleen that had thought her own genetics had been killing her children, so they were getting closer and closer to proving that her theory was correct. A team of 27 scientists would ultimately discover that both Kathleen and her 2 daughters, Sarah and Laura, carried this rare genetic mutation called CARM2G114R, a gene that really had only been recently discovered, found to cause serious cardiac abnormalities that often resulted in the death of an infant. Upon this stunning discovery, cardiology and genetic experts both agreed that this mutation was the probable cause of both Sarah and Laura's passings. This same gene was not found in either Caleb nor Patrick, but the 2 boys did share their own genetic mutation, and this genetic mutation was actually found to cause seizures in mice. And as you may remember, Patrick actually suffered from seizures, and that was thought to be the cause of his death. And in 2021, a collective of 90 leading scientists signed a petition that stated they believed that Kathleen Folbigg was innocent due to recent medical and scientific discoveries, and they strongly suggested that she be pardoned from prison. As a result, a new inquiry began in late 2022 and wrapped up just this April of 2023. And again, all the key evidence was looked at. Dr. Joanna Garsang, an expert on sudden unexplained infant deaths, commented on the diary entries, which had finally been analysed by experts after all these years, and she stated, quote, "The expressions of self-blame and guilt in Miss Folbigg's diaries fit with those described in the literature or that I have witnessed in my clinical and research practice. I do not consider them true confessions of guilt. Miss Folbigg is blaming herself for the deaths. she may be considering that her stress caused the deaths, end quote. And it was also discussed the possibility that Kathleen had suffered from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which seems like a very real possibility to me, at least. The theory that Kathleen had smothered all 4 of her children was also seriously put into question when world-renowned pediatric intensivist professor Peter Fleming, another massive mouthful there, who has in the past investigated the deaths of hundreds of children, stated, quote, "I would find it very hard to believe that somebody could suffocate them by pushing something over their face or obstructing their airways and leave no marks. I find it very hard to envisage any way you could do that without pushing pressure on the lips and teeth. I would find that extraordinary," end quote. And that's a pretty powerful quote, in my opinion. And again, we're seeing now that not only is science, technology and medical research finally catching up during this inquiry, but, we're seeing experts come forward and finally defend the diary entries that were criticised in 2003. And of course, the genetic mutation, the CALM2 gene, was a very heavy focus of this entire inquiry and really what it focused around. And just this past May, a group of senior legal academics wrote to the New South Wales Attorney General insisting that Kathleen Folbigg be released from prison based on all of this new evidence. And finally, the New South Wales Director of Public Prosecution concluded that there was indeed reasonable doubt in the Kathleen Folbigg case. On June 5, 2023, the New South Wales Governor, Margaret Beazley, finally pardoned Kathleen and she was released from prison after serving 20 years of a 25-year sentence. This pardon, however, does not actually quash her conviction. So basically, if Kathleen wants to, she could take this to the Court of Criminal Appeals in an effort to get her convictions overturned. And if she is successful in doing this, she could be up for significant compensation. So if we are to compare this case to the Lindy Chamberlain case, the Dingo Ate My Baby case, she was in jail for 3 years back in 1992 and she received $1.3 million in damages. So we can only assume that Kathleen would be up for many, many millions more if she is successful in having her conviction overturned. And the thing is, no matter how much money she may be compensated or eligible for or be able to receive, it's still never going to give her back the years that she lost. She's just turned 56, I believe. She's still young. She can still go out and live her life, but she's lost 20 years. That's massive, and nothing's ever going to bring that back. No amount of money could possibly bring that back. Not to mention, no amount of money is going to heal the emotional trauma, the physical trauma, and the pain and suffering that not only Kathleen went through, but her friends and family. I, for one, am very interested to see what Kathleen's next move is, but whatever she does choose to do next, I do hope that she finds peace and happiness in her life finally. I really do, because this woman has been through the ringer. But let me know your thoughts down below on this utterly insane case. This woman, the fact she's still alive and standing today, incredible. Anyway, until next time, stay vigilant and stay safe.